Hi everyone, welcome back to the live stream. This is the Cloud Native live stream. I'm joined by John McBride today. So to get started here, we'll just do a brief introduction, and then the topic today is going to be getting started in open source and really trying to get you some advice around picking your first issue. I've been able to finally weed my way through this, so I'm going to share my very recent experience. But John has a lot more experience than I do. He's a veteran in the space, and so I'm curious to get his advice and to pick his brain and hopefully share all his knowledge with everyone here. So for everybody watching, thank you for joining. Let's just dive in. So my name is Josh Duffney. I'm an advocate at Microsoft on the Cloud Native team. Before joining Microsoft, I was an SRE at Stack Overflow. And so I've kind of been wandering my way into the open source world ever since I read The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim. And so worked in that capacity for a while. And then I've been, kind of my career started on the help desk, and I've been slowly walking my way all the way to the programming stack. So walking the full stack. Very interesting to find myself here after my Visual Basic class where I swore off programming, and now here I am. So I'll kind of, that's a brief introduction to me. I want to turn it over to John to give an introduction to himself.
Yeah, Visual Basic. What a place to start. I think when I was a kid, I had a giant textbook that I was like, I'm gonna get through this and learn to program. I never did. But hey, everyone, my name is John McBride. I'm a senior software engineer at OpenSauced, and we're doing a bunch of stuff with building tooling for maintainers of open source projects and for enablers of open source projects, like people in the Kubernetes community. So check it out. But I have a deep background in open source at Amazon, which was my last job. I was working on the BottleRocket operating system, which is a Linux-based operating system in the open source for container workloads. I've worked on Kubernetes stuff in Cluster API and core Kubernetes. My probably biggest claim to fame is maintaining SPF 13 Cobra, which is a Go CLI bootstrapping library thing for CLIs. Yeah. And before that, I was at VMware and Pivotal doing Cloud Foundry stuff and more Kubernetes stuff.
Pivotal brings me back, man.
The Pivotal days. Yeah, I love Pivotal. But alas, it is no more. It's now part of the VMware legacy. That's now part of Broadcom. So it all comes full circle eventually.
It's weird being in tech a little, coming up on 15 years and seeing that cycle start to repeat. Kind of decentralization, centralization, contract, expand type thing. So yeah, with the introductions out of the way, I need more coffee. That's what I definitely need.
Oh yeah.
Should have refilled before we started. But anyway, what I wanted to do is just kind of share the benefits to get people kind of interested and hooked in this, because coming into the space, into more programming in general, it's like, what do? I can build all these little sample projects. I can grind out leak code, but I'm not really getting the same practicality. I remember going back to, so where I first got hooked into programming, and people kind of balk at this a little bit, but was with PowerShell and scripting, because I was a sysadmin and I had to disable 300 user accounts. And they would just divvy that up at the help desk. And so this other gentleman and myself discovered, hey, there's this thing called PowerShell, and we can write 4 lines and it's done in seconds, And so scripting was kind of my entry point into it, and the benefit there. But the difference between that time in my career and this time is, I don't have the real world problems to solve with it. If you're not already in the role, if you're not already on a software team, those problems are just hitting you in the face. And I found a really good home for myself in the open source community. And the last couple of years, now I'm actually being faced with these real world problems. I'm forced to collaborate with people. I'm learning from people. They're mentoring me. And I'm actually contributing something back that's going to be used, in whatever capacity that is. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the hook, is it gives you that real world learning experience that I used to have being in a role. Where I can kind of gain and exercise those things. So yeah, that's what I've seen so far. And I'm 2 years into this particular journey, writing real programming languages with air quotes, solving the application type things instead of the glue code that I used to write. And I did eventually write some things I probably shouldn't have written in PowerShell, but it was the hammer I knew how to wield the best. So it worked. So with that out of the way, I kind of wanted to pitch that. That's a good benefit for getting people into open source. You get real world experience. What kind of is your sales pitch to people when, they're like, oh, should I contribute? Should I not? Or people shouldn't contribute?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's in my opinion, very few downsides to contributing to open source. There's always nuance to this discussion because it's easy to say the word like open source and you just kind of get a picture in your mind of something, but that could be different to many different people in many different positions at different companies. Like some things when I was at Amazon, I just could not contribute to because it didn't work for the bottom line of the business at AWS. So that's always a consideration. I just kind of throw that out there as the first thing is like, if you're at a job, don't, check with your open source programs office or whoever is doing open source at your company to make sure it's just kind of generally vaguely okay. Most stuff is fine, but you can find yourself in some like nasty, sticky situations. So not a lawyer, but I like to throw that out there at the beginning because those things exist. Yeah, I like to masquerade as a lawyer in a night job, but don't hire me as a lawyer. But yeah, I think the skills part of it is really maybe the big first obvious one that a lot of people go to. I go to that one. I think that's what I've seen the biggest benefit in my career and just my like software engineer journey is like, wow, I've gotten to build all these skills and all these things at a scale that I would never ever be able to get to on my own. Even I really can't imagine another place that I've been able to contribute into or had the opportunity to contribute into where there's thousands and thousands of developers across hundreds and hundreds of companies doing, all sort of the same thing in the same direction. And that was the Kubernetes community. Like contributing into Kubernetes is kind of wild, just the absolute massive contributor community scale that exists there. So you get to build some really big skills inside of those communities, and it's not just code either. Like this is the other thing I like to mention always is contribution into these communities is so much more than cutting code or reviewing code, which I think gets a lot of the limelight. There's just being a part of the community. There's stuff like this. Like I would, this is an AKS live for this community. And I would say this is a contribution in some regards to the community, just being a part of it, answering questions, making the community welcoming, like giving some good strength to that contributor experience, which a lot of people like to abbreviate as contribx. Contributing into contribx is very big. Like it just makes the experience for everybody better. So that's another thing I always like to mention is that, there's skills to be built, but there's also just like the communities to be a part of. And then the last thing I'll say here on this point is this always kind of leads my mind into a more like philosophical realm around just the like ideals of open source and sort of what it means to our modern day infrastructure of technology today. Like Kubernetes is a great example where, there's this platform that you can run stuff on, you can run apps on. Like, okay, great, cool. Like you could do that on Linux, you can do that on a bunch of different stuff. But a bunch of companies have bought into services and things that work for this platform for Kubernetes. And then there's companies that build stuff on top of that and on top of that. And you can kind of get this like tower of technology infrastructure that the base, really the foundation is the Kubernetes community on top of a lot of these things. And the Kubernetes, output, sure, the code output, but also just like the welcoming part of the community, the pipelines of people taking, going from beginners to eventually leaders. That's a big part of like the underlying infrastructure that just makes all this work. And I usually call this the greater good. It's almost like the roads and the sidewalks and just the like literal infrastructure like we would see in a city of what makes the communities work today. So that's another big reason I say people should contribute into open source at all levels is because you're sort of giving back some of your time and energy into these really important pieces of technology infrastructure that hold up a lot of the world today, which is kind of wild to think about. Like you and I can be a part of just the massive greater good of this technology infrastructure that makes it work today, right? And I can't think of a better reason, to do open source than that, honestly.
Well, yeah, if you want to have any if you have any doubt about the impact or the projects that have been built on top of Kubernetes, just go to the CNCF landscape.
Exactly.
I think I need to find it so I can throw it on the show. But my favorite one is with Homer, and he's like ascending into heaven. He's walking up on the stairs, and then it
Yeah.
collapses and goes into hell, and then all the CNCF projects kind of pop up. And so that's
Yeah.
kind of just a funny, like, if you're going to adopt Kubernetes, just wait, and you're going to have all these other things to worry about. But that's an aside. The one interesting thing that you mentioned there that I hadn't really thought about or considered is that open source as a whole, as a community, and then there's pockets in there, right? When you find your project or find a project, there's a sub community in there, but they're all part of kind of the overarching open source community. And I'll just kind of bring some experience or share some things from my past, which again, the PowerShell community, that had a nice little vibrant community. It has its little conference. And I kind of grew up, so to speak, in my tech career in that community. And I can't quantify the, well, maybe I can, because it's the primary reason that I have the job that I have right now is because of the connections that I made in that community. But yeah, the tremendous impact of just being a part of a broader community and building those connections has had on my career and the success that I've had thus far in my career. Like that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about, is like open source as a whole as a community. And then inside there you have, your Go developers, and you have your Rust developers, and you have this. Go seems to take up a big portion, especially if you're working with Kubernetes.
That's something then you have your pockets. Yeah, the pockets and kind of the ecosystem of things. That's something we actually think a lot about at OpenSauced, is like this kind of graph. We call it like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon sometimes. Just this kind of graph of like, okay, like John exists over here, maybe in like Cobra and doing some, random Kubernetes things every once in a while. And, Josh maybe exists over here doing some PowerShell things. There's a graph of like how, John contributes into project A, B, C, and then Josh contributes into X, Y, Z. And there's a graph that we meet somewhere inside of kind of this broader, ecosystem graph theory thing of open source. And you do sort of eventually start to see how small it really is, in my opinion. Like especially in the Kubernetes community, I feel this all the time. Like you show up to Kubernetes SIG meetings or something, or you show up to KubeCon or whatever, and it's sort of the same like 200 people that are doing a lot of contribution into sort of the broader ecosystem, and then that kind of leads out into the wider world of open source and things. And it always surprises me, the overlap. It always surprises me like where I end up seeing people, like in Cobra or in other Go stuff, and it's like, oh, like I know that person from Kubernetes thing over there, or I know that person from this other Go thing I contribute into. Like very cool. It's a pretty small world, and we could do a whole live just on like the networking within open source, and how powerful that can be for your career, for building skills, for finding, other projects and other things to like work on, or use at your company. Like I love finding little tidbits and things to, run on my home lab, or to, I don't know, just stuff that's like, oh, cool, I want to use this because I know Josh works on this thing. I'm going to give it a try, and then start like hacking on it, and things grow from there. Right.
One thing that struck me, just on one little note more on the community aspect, is I love I forget where I originally heard it, but it's been in a lot of self-help books, but you are the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And I walked into the Kubernetes, walked in virtually, joined the hangout or whatever, the Kubernetes LTS support meetings that are going on.
Oh yeah.
That was announced, I think, at KubeCon
North America.
North America. And I was quickly humbled. The people in there are crazy smart. Like they're just really, really good. But I learned just from listening and having them talk through different scenarios and stuff. I learned so much from them, and I feel like I leveled up in just attending a few calls, to be honest. So that's one little aspect that we can, like, how do you get connected in these things? Well, a lot of these projects that I've known, they have some kind of like agenda and cadence to meet, and they're usually Zoom meetings or team meetings or hangouts, and they usually have like some kind of a Slack or Discord channel. And so that's how you can kind of get plugged in, I guess, into kind of rubbing the shoulders. So until you can stand on their shoulders, you can kind of rub shoulders, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Is there are a lot of these sort of common spaces where these people hang out, and that's really a good first step for anybody, regardless of your seniority level or whatever. you got to start somewhere, and usually it's by hanging out where the people hang out who are doing the work. There's a lot of these Slack communities, like, it's easy to go back to Kubernetes because it's very, very well supported by the CNCF, and there's like these Slack groups, there's SIG meetings you can show up to, there's conferences, there's all this kind of stuff that gives you sort of the infrastructure of the technology infrastructure to do the stuff that we need to, to continue to move the needle forward. I think that there are definitely open source communities out there that could do a better job at this. And I put myself in the own bucket. Like, I know that I could do a much better job at creating those spaces for Cobra people to, sort of find the community, because right now it's just basically the GitHub. If you need to get a hold of me, just drop an issue in the GitHub. It's not a great way, because I'm not always, in there 100%, because it's not part of my day job. But it's something I go back to, is like, how can I personally make the contributor experience better, or create better pipelines to enable people to sort of level themselves up, or like rise the ranks, so to speak, of, like, I know nothing to I know a little bit. Now I'm like a collaborator status. Maybe then I become a maintainer or even owner of this thing. And you see that a lot in really good communities, where there's like very well-defined pipelines to go from like, the very most novice rank all the way up to like leadership status. And that's good. Like, we should have that, but that doesn't exist in every community, unfortunately.
Yeah, I haven't seen that particular ladder super paved on the ones that I've contributed to. So now, well, this is actually a good point. So we'll just take this conversation wherever it goes. So my next point that I want to talk about is kind of like, I think the only drawback really to contributing, so now that we've talked about all the benefits, is the time. Like, if you're going to make a meaningful contribution, it's going to take some time. Just from my personal experience the past couple of weeks. So I've been working on a project called Ratify, and it's an admission controller for Kubernetes. So it takes policies and says, oh, hey, do you have a signature? Or hey, do you have this? And then if it doesn't, it will reject you. Right. And I talked about that technology at Build last year. And then I've just been learning more about it after having used it for a while and having to create some demos around it. And then I had some empty cycles at the end of the year. DevRel kind of winds down. I was like, oh, this is a perfect time to jump into some code. Yeah. And so I worked with, how should we pause? I'll pause. I'll come back to that, pin that idea that just popped up. But anyway, what I've been doing, like, I looked, like, when did I agree to take on this thing? And I was like, oh, it's been 2 weeks already. And I'm just now at the point where I'm starting to make tweaks to the code to see if my feature is going to work. Right. So it took legitimately 3 to 4 days to just like mentally build out a model in my brain of how this particular feature works for the section of the code that I'm going to be tinkering with. So, reading code and playing around, going through the debugger, talking to people, asking questions, 3 to 4 days just to get acquainted. And then I kind of took a couple days to like, hey, this is using the plugin architecture. Haven't really done a lot with that. What are the ways to do that? Okay, they're doing a binary. You could do it with interface that would be cleaner, but that would require like 3 months of refactoring to do for this project, and so that was like another week. And so here I am at 2 weeks. And then just this morning, I started to change the code. Like, oh, I can get errors back now. So let's focus on that. But that's 2 weeks down, right? Pretty much more or less full time on that thing. And so that's kind of like the only downside. But I think that they can be augmented pretty quickly. And I kind of want to pitch this over to you, which is picking the right projects. I saw a really good quote where people were like, oh, don't do open source, waste of time. Or like, when do I contribute it? And the retweet was, you should always choose some kind of project, especially, I would assume this is especially if it's on the side, that you already use, you're a power user of. So kind of take it from there. Like, how do you walk through picking projects, and how have you coached people through picking the right project to work in? Because it is a time commitment, massive time commitment.
Yeah. It is. It can be a massive time sink. And depending on the project and the like dev cycles within that project, like how often it releases, how often PRs get reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. It could be like month long cycles, which can be a big brain drain, unfortunately. But that is sort of the ecosystem of open source, where it's like a lot of stuff just moves a lot slower, given that there's not like always a product manager pushing a needle, or there's not like, business leaders saying like, we need to ship this now. That gets a little muddy in some of these communities that have a lot of like commercial influence on them. So maybe we disregard that a little bit. But I usually, I do like to tell people that, if you want to start contributing to open source, and again, I kind of go back to this like Stallman philosophy of like, yes, like open source into the like greater good of the infrastructure for technology today. Finding those things you already use and you already are like passionate about is a really good way to just kind of find the time and motivation, because oftentimes it's like, I found a bug in this thing that I use all the time. Why is it broken? Well, I should fix it because there's nobody else who's going to fix it besides me. Oftentimes there's these communities that are like, oh, you found a bug. Okay, you can fix it. Like we don't have a commercial interest to like push the needle forward to like always be fixing like these tiny little sharp edges for people. A good example is there's a lot of these like tiny little apps, these tiny little CLI apps I use, sort of in replacement of other things. Like there's a Spotify terminal user interface I use, which
I've
is
not heard of that.
it's kind of bonkers. It's a little silly, but it works well. But it has a lot of these sharp edges, and it was just some dude's like side project from years ago that went viral. But people are like, oh, this is so cool, I'm going to use this in my terminal. It has all these little sharp edges because of that, but there's no real interest to like really push the needle forward on it, because it's just like kind of a side project thing. So like you find a bug, you fix it, period. Like that's a huge motivation, where it's like I keep hitting a sharp edge on something, I'm going to go fix it. On these things that I'm a power user of. I find that all the time in the NeoVim community as well, which is another good example of something that's like has a very powerful community behind it, but zero commercial interest divulged into it. So if I find something that I just don't like or don't fix, I'm either A, going to go try to upstream a fix, or B, going to just write a plugin that fixes it for me. And then if people want to use that plugin, fine, they can. And they can cut me issues if they find little things. I'm probably just going to tell them like, hey, I don't have time to like spend a whole 2 weekends fixing this. Feel free to drop a pull request and I'll review it and I'll accept it and we'll put it in, and then it fixes it for everybody. This is great. And that's sort of the cycle of the whole thing. It's, I have to admit as well that like I've had a lot of good luck in my jobs, basically just working in open source. Like AWS was kind of unreal in this regard, where like very few people at AWS get to work 100% of the time in open source. But having landed on the Bottle Rocket team, the whole operating system is open sourced, and it's like, well, we're all just gonna work in the open source, and that gave us a lot of kind of ability to go into other communities that we used things in, like a lot of Kubernetes operators and things that worked and integrated with Bottle Rocket, to then kind of bridge that gap of like, things at AWS, Bottle Rocket, things that in Kubernetes land in the open source, and oftentimes we would go into the upstream to do that. So that was more or less part of my job, which, if you are somebody who's like really passionate about open source like me, then you should probably take the path I did and try to find a job where you can work on open source all the time as part of your job. Because it's just hard to do. I'd be surprised if there was anybody today in 2023 who was spending a lot of time dropping like very significant pieces of code or issues or bugs in like Kubernetes stuff, who wasn't making it as part of their job today. Mostly just because, the thing has such huge scale today. I can't imagine anybody who would. Like, when I was at AWS, it was very easy to, go into my AWS dev account and spin up, like 10 virtual machines, bootstrap a bunch of Kubernetes stuff. And it cost me $0 because I was at AWS and,
right.
I needed it for my job. I would not do that today because it would be pretty expensive to actually do like high scale debugging work that I was doing with Bottle Rocket in AWS on Kubernetes stuff. Like, you see kind of where I'm going. Like, there is sort of maybe a ceiling to some of these things where it just makes sense to go make it part of your career, like your literal career, your job.
Yeah, with all the open source things that companies use, I think the piece of advice, the segue that I would do, if you can't, it's probably more realistic to pick a smaller type, like the CLI project you can contribute to. But if you're doing anything kind of like the Kubernetes contributions and stuff like that, you want to tie it into your day job just because there aren't enough hours in the day, and that's stealing away from, if you have a family or if you've got other interests and hobbies,
Right.
You got to pay it on the dime. But, that might be an area where you can influence your company to be like, hey, we really need this fix.
Yeah.
I can go and contribute it. And so that might be one way to kind of pick the project. So I would say there's the
Exactly.
there's the three paths, like start with the side projects that are smaller, try to find something that's applicable, but then maybe even start searching jobs that are primarily open source focused. Like you're
Right.
working on open source as part of the day job, as full time.
That's a very common path. I saw people especially at VMware take, where we had a pretty significant presence in the Kubernetes community, especially in stuff like cluster API. A lot of people got started just doing like very little things or making like little operator pods that worked on like local hardware or something, and then they started doing like little things in projects like cluster API or some of the cluster API providers like in Azure or in GCP or AWS or something. That got them noticed, and that got them sort of recognition within the community, which that community was made up of a lot of VMware people. And then it's kind of like, oh, there's a job. Let's hire this guy. He's already doing some of the work,
That's
that was
a really, really good point is, like that's a perfect way to walk on to a job that you
Yes.
really want, is start doing the work, start doing the contribution, because then you proved yourself. You're already onboarded. Like that 2-week thing that I was talking about, where it took me, I'm more or less 2 weeks in and I'm just now understanding a component where, like that's going to be an onboarding experience if you can get someone completely fresh. We had a good question pop up real quick just in the middle of this.
Sure.
And it was, say you jump on a new project that's, I think any language is more applicable to, but particularly Rust and Go. And there's a lot of unknown libraries. Like, what do you do to familiarize yourself with that? I'll go first and then you can take a stab. What I do is I usually am like jumping through. Well, I'll probably check out the documentation first. Like, what is this package supposed to do? Is it a logging package? Is it a HTTP wrapper or a framework or whatever, web framework? And just see what the kind of the basic use cases are. And then if it gets any more advanced than that, I usually am walking through with a debugger and seeing like what it's doing. But that's how I familiarize myself. And I don't try to master the package or whatever. I only care about like what is it doing in the code that I care about. Because I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes for like, oh, now I got to learn this whole new web framework when it's only, exposing one little feature of it. So I try to constrain myself as much as possible, and that happens to just exactly what I care about or what the project I care about does. But what would you say to this question, John?
Yeah, that's a great question. I need to take my own medicine and read the manual because I really don't. Which bites me in the butt, and I know I could save myself a lot of time. Recently I've been wanting to get more into like, I've done a little bit of this, but I've been wanting to get more into like woodworking, which would require like using more power tools and stuff. And especially with stuff like that where it can be very dangerous, you really need to read the manual. So it really depends, I guess, with that analogy is like, if you're playing with fire, then like, yeah, please read the manual. Some things that come to mind that would be very good to like read the docs first are like encryption pieces of software or stuff that's doing anything with like JSON web tokens or any of that, where it's like one little misstep could be a massively critical failure or security vulnerability. So stuff like that, those are the power tools of libraries. Go read those docs. But usually with probably 99% of stuff, when I approach a project that has a new library I don't know, I'll pop open crates.io for Rust or go.dev or something with the library in there. And usually those have kind of a very high level overview or like a table of contents with like most of the public API function names. And that actually gets you pretty far where, say I was reading some code that had a library I didn't know about. I went to the docs real quick and it had like 5 function names. And it was like, the 5 function names were like get, put, update, delete, and I don't know, something else. That would pretty quickly tell me or give me an idea of what's going on in there within that kind of library of things just by the function names. And then it kind of is a fast track to like, okay, I kind of sort of know maybe what I need or where I need to go. And then can go deeper from there. But yeah, most of the time, I think it kind of ends up being a lot of like referential knowledge of things. A lot of these things sort of end up being similar-ish when you've been around long enough or seen, enough of them. Maybe a good analogy is back to like power tools of things. Like once you know how like the table saw works and the circular saw works and stuff, you can kind of get a good idea of like, okay, maybe I can start to understand how this like track saw works, which is basically just a circular saw on a track. And you don't have to like go completely relearn how circular saw works. This analogy is maybe a little too out there.
No, it's making sense to me because
it's making sense. Yeah.
Well, if you've built or you've tinkered with kind of a logging package or whatever, and it's just formatted differently,
Exactly.
like you don't need to go and pill it. But like for me, like encryption's been a gray hole, like a gray area for me for a while. Like I kind of get it, I know how to use it, but I don't really like down to the algorithm part. I don't really know what's going on. I think you took a deep dive into that. Was it last year sometime? And was it keys or what was it that you were diving into?
So last year, or I guess and this was one of those things that was not like a short feature ad. This was like 6 weeks of research and implementation. But on BottleRocket, we had something called the BottleRocket update operator, which is a Kubernetes operator that automatically updates the BottleRocket nodes in your Kubernetes cluster when there's a new version in our distro stream, which basically is just like, okay, we release BottleRocket, bam, your BottleRocket update operator gets that new version and automatically updates your nodes, which is really great from a security standpoint because almost all of the releases, given the paradigm of BottleRocket, were security releases. And most people were using BottleRocket because it's a more secure operating system than something you would use like Ubuntu or Alpine. So there was a sort of nasty problem in there, which wasn't really a real problem. It was more like a security theoretical problem that like if somebody was on the cluster network, we had an API pod and an operator pod, and those communicated. If somebody was on the cluster network, that was essentially just it was just like unencrypted, just HTTP requests.
Telnet or something between them.
Not Telnet. I think it was just base. Yeah, it was just like the what is that Rust crate request or whatever it's called. So it was just HTTP, like normal nothing, which is like fine in a secured network on Kubernetes. But if that network for some reason, if the firewall was busted through, or if somebody was able to own the network from a security standpoint, they could essentially prevent your BottleRocket nodes from updating by intercepting that traffic, and then ABC, XYZ, they could get on your nodes if they prevented those nodes from updating, and there was a critical security vulnerability that hadn't been updated. So the next steps for me was essentially to research and investigate how we could do like pretty good, or aka good enough, mutual transport layer security between those pods, MTLS, where both pods, the API pod and the operator pod, knew about each other and knew each other's basically handshakes and could communicate securely over a secured connection. And you'd think that would just be like an easy 2 lines of code in this kind of conglomeration of Kubernetes stuff, but it was actually quite a lot of stuff to implement. There was some nasty stuff in there where we had to remove OpenSSL because OpenSSL had a weird security vulnerability we needed removed, and using the Rust implementation of OpenSSL. And I won't go too much further into this because it was some pretty nasty
like a perfect. I mean, you just sharing that short story is a perfect example of like finding your way into those really real problems that you learn a tremendous amount from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this was one of those things that like I think was quite a huge lift, and was not something I was going to be able to do really by myself. Like I did most of the implementation, but I needed to consult with people in Amazon open source security, within the BottleRocket team, our tech lead. I had a lot of great conversations with people in the Kubernetes community who had done this sort of thing in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So it was not something that I just like one day was like, I'm going to go fix this. It was like, we need to fix this. I'm going to do a lot of research, talk with a lot of people. And I think this goes back to what I was saying about like existing in these communities and stuff. If I think if I had approached this from a very like sort of naive standpoint where I was just like, I'm just going to go do this, I probably would have implemented it wrong without having asked the right questions to the right groups of people in the right communities. And it, you know, we just find ourselves back at square one if it's implemented wrong, especially with stuff like MTLS, because you just open yourself up to potentially more security vulnerabilities if it's done incorrectly. So existing in those communities that, you know, that can be huge even for like real future work that you're doing within kind of the same like spaces of these communities.
That's like,
right?
that's the exact spot that I'm in right now, where like I could see what could be done better. And so I need to find the right people to ask the questions that I have. But in this, and maybe even yourself would be one, but so if the thing that I have is we're using the plugin architecture, but they're just executing the binary, but that doesn't create a nice clear contract between the plugin infrastructure and the plugin source code and the main program that's being run. And then like, how do you pass errors back to that are, because when you're doing the command line, really all you can do is standard in, standard error, standard out. And then how do you parse those? How do you return them all? I'll shelf that for them, but I'm in that same discovery phase where I know what I need to do, but I want to seek out how people have done this in the past, because I know it's been solved. Like Containerd has a really good framework for it, but like, who do I talk to there? If I was more connected in those communities, I'd have more contacts. So, but this is the opportunity for me to make those contacts and network. So
yeah,
we'll just we'll put that there. I want to switch though back to the projects, because I've dabbled in OpenSauced a little bit to explore it. And I saw that you can connect it, and it kind of gives you a way to navigate open source projects. How could I use that to help me find a project? You know, like maybe it's in the right network that I want or the right space. Like, what are some levers that tool that you guys are building would help me do that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things to come to with kind of what we've built and, you know, our road ahead for sure. But, you know, with OpenSauced today, you can look and get insights into specific sort of smaller ecosystems of things like, oh, I'm really interested in Rust or Go or JavaScript. I want to find projects and communities that are active within those smaller ecosystems, and that you can kind of start to dive into and be like, okay, I'm interested maybe in JavaScript. Oh, there's this cool thing called, you know, Bun or whatever. Like, let's dive into that. Who are the people, or really like the who's who of those projects, and start like diving in and seeing who those people are. Because one thing I think that like is pretty universal for open source contributors, or I would argue really anybody who exists within any open source spaces. It's sort of like finding out the who's who can be really challenging, and understanding like just kind of how these ecosystems, like the vibes of these ecosystems, what they're like sometimes, because it can just be so hard to show up to a project, look on the GitHub, and you're just kind of like, okay, great, maybe I'll like drop an issue or drop a pull request, but for all you know, the project could have been abandoned months ago, and not had a commit or something. You know, you could dive into the commit log or something, or look at the issues and see how recently those have been contributed to. But you do get a good insight with OpenSauced on like how some of these communities, sort of the vibe check. I think as Baduggy would like to say, Brian Douglas, who's our CEO, you kind of start to get the vibe check on some of these, you know, and one thing that,
do you have like a rating of like hostility? Like how welcoming are they? And I'm just, that's kind of a joke aside, but yeah. Because some of them can be super welcoming and friendly, and then other ones are very stoic, and then other ones are like, what are you doing here? Or dropping PRs in my code.
I mean, we've thought about something like that. It would not be hard to do. Like with all these AI things, you can do sentiment analysis, and you know, AWS has all these like sentiment analysis services that you could just like pump a bunch of stuff into, and it would tell you like, oh, this is a 1 out of 10 for angry, or 10 out of 10 for angry, or 5 out of 10 for happiness or whatever. And so like, sure, we could do that, but like, we also want to really, you know, not just make it so that like, oh, this is a platform where we can find out about good open source things happening in open source, but we really want to also like help the maintainers of these things understand their projects and understand like how they, the maintainers, can help those projects operate better. So we're not sure if giving people like a score really probably makes sense. Yeah. So
they took away the dislike probably for a reason, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So
it doesn't make humanity better.
Exactly. But I think there are things that, like I look at in Cobra, like I have a dashboard, we call it an insight page that you can create. So like I have an insight page for all the Cobra projects and important Cobra projects within sort of the Cobra ecosystem. Things like kubectl, SPF 13 Viper is another really important one. And I use that to look at velocity of PRs coming in. And I look at stuff like how fast stuff is getting closed, because that can sort of start to give you an idea and insight of developer cycles within these projects and how fast things move. And that in itself is a good vibe check for some of these communities. And starts to give you an idea of like, oh, this person is active here, is also active here and here and here. Maybe that's a person that I, as a maintainer of this ecosystem, can start to, build some more trust with and start to sort of, I guess, mentor in a way and maybe help them rise up to a collaborator status or maintainer status. Because, one thing that, and this is a totally different tangent as well, but one thing that I think about a lot is the lottery factor in projects. And I think canonically in the past it was called the bus factor, but it's sort of this idea of like, okay, what happens when this like one individual wins the lottery and they just disappear? Like, what happens to the project? What happens to the community? What happens to maybe the company? What happens to their code bits that they were pushing in? That can be really scary for a lot of projects, because oftentimes it is just one or two, maybe three people who are sort of pushing stuff in and really moving the needle forward, especially on some code stuff or security stuff. So, finding those people or having those pipelines available to start mentoring and raising people up inside of communities is so important. And that's, again, another reason that I'm a huge advocate of enabling new people to come into open source, because those pipelines dry up fast. Like, it is just inevitable that people will leave open source projects. It just happens. Like it's
well, yeah, so that's something I've been giving a lot of thought of, just reflecting on my own career the last couple of years. As you go through, technology moves so fast that eventually you're forced to well, you don't really have to, but there's more opportunity for you and more growth for you if you do a transition. If you move into a new technology or a new discipline. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about working in technology, but it's also slightly terrifying. Like when I kind of get into Microsoft, and it had been going on for a while, but I saw like slowly started to disconnect from the community, the PowerShell community that I've been such an advocate for and contributor to, just because my work was changing and my discipline was changing, and then finding a new one. And so that, like, anything that can help people do that, plus that people are always going to leave, even the top of the field. Like, I've been in the industry long enough, like all the heavy hitters that grew up around me in my space they're retired, or they're kind of gone off and done, like, moved into director roles where they don't really do the things that they used to, or they burn themselves out on it. It's like, that's inevitable. You have to have some kind of replacement. But it seems really interesting in the open source space, because that feedback loop is really quick, and there's less anchoring them to a particular thing, right? Because there's so many different things they could do. The two interesting things that came up to me as you're explaining OpenSauced that could help me is like finding out who's involved, and then also kind of the health check of the community. Like, is this something that's really going to help, that I could fit into, or that's active, or it would be mutually beneficial, which is super cool. Gives me more reason to go in. Maybe I can even use that for the space that I'm in, and see who's the top contribs and where I'm at. So that's cool.
Yeah. And I think a health check is a good way of putting that to a specific lens, because, just like a doctor or a nurse would use specific health metrics to determine, like, hey, what's going on with your body or your physiology. You can use a lot of the metrics that we derive out of open source communities to sort of figure out, like, okay, what's going on here? Like, why did things slow down at the end of December? What's going on? Well, it's the holiday, right?
Right.
You could start to really, like, figure out what's happening around these communities and around these projects, given their health metrics. So yeah, I think that's a great lens to look through.
Cool. Well, we're getting close on time. The last one that I wanted to dig into here, last little topic, is around picking the right issue. So I'll just kind of share my brief experience with the last one that I did, because it's worked out really well. And it might be worth replicating, but I also want to get your input too, like maybe what I could do better, or what you do, or even in like scoping issues. So what I did is I noticed that I had some time, and I wanted to do some more coding. And so I reached out to a project that I was working on, which was Ratify. And so I joined the community meetings, and some of the people work internal Microsoft. So it was a little bit easier to make that introduction. It wasn't somebody in a different organization or just out in the world. I'd run by him a couple times. But what I did was I went and like, hey, I'd like to contribute. Can you help me find some issues that are like one, impactful to the project, that'd be meaningful, instead of just going through and figuring out what my existing skills could use, because I wanted to stretch myself, but I also wanted it to be impactful. And so I just kind of switched it up, had the conversation with them, and it ended up taking. I was very grateful for this individual because they took the time. It took about 3 days to go through the issues and then go and chat with the tech lead and go and chat with their manager. A lot of people that are involved heavily in the project, and came back with like 3 or 4 options for me to revisit. And so then I picked the top one that he recommended, or the first one based on impact. And now I'm learning a ton of stuff. So there kind of goes into the community aspect. Like if I were to go through this again, and I've done this in the past, I wouldn't go through the issues myself and just kind of pick one. I would try to open some kind of dialogue with the maintainers and the current contributors to figure out like what's actually useful here. But I want to throw it over to you. Like how do you navigate from a maintainer perspective, and incentivize the right issues, and then from a contributor perspective, like how do you scope your own?
Yeah. Quick touch base. Can you still hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, my AirPods died. Sorry about that.
That's why I'm always wired.
I should have gone wired to begin with.
A smooth transition to the backups, though. That was
smooth.
That was
no
smooth.
problem. Yeah, from a maintainer's standpoint, I guess it's tricky. Like it's hard to find these like little things that maybe I could label as like good first issue, or things that maybe to me I would just be like, oh, boom, 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 I'll just pound that out real fast. But again, I go back to like the idea of like a pipeline, where it's like I don't just want to pound out a bunch of stuff, a bunch of like small PRs that I could easily quickly fix. I want to enable the community and help the pipeline fill up a little bit by maybe having some good first issues, which is a pretty common one you'll see on GitHub. Little things that seem, at least on the surface, simple to start with, but it's hard, because even things that I would label as good first issue sometimes can be like just these, like you start pulling on the thread and then the whole thing just unravels, and you're just like, oh, I did not expect that. I'm sorry. I've definitely
done this to you.
Yeah, I've labeled stuff before, and then somebody gets into it and they're like, I'm lost. This is crazy. What's going on? And I'm just like, I'm so sorry. This was a lot harder than I anticipated. And in those cases, I'll actually try to like pair up with that person and maybe add some commits to their pull request if they're like struggling with a certain part or something. And that actually requires a lot more like deeper dedication of like time and energy into something big like that. So obviously for that reason, I think finding something that's not going to be like huge or big refactors across like multiple packages or multiple services even, or getting into, where it's like, oh, this ends up being a big refactor. That to me immediately is a stink that it's too much for somebody who's new, or if I'm approaching a project that's newish. But oftentimes, I go back to the human element of things. And I think before I lost audio, you were saying this, but so I'll just, if there's a community, I'll just ask like, hey, what's good to like get started on? There's a project called Bluefin, which is very cool.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. It's a friend of mine, George Castro, who was at VMware, and I think is at CNCF now, doing a lot of dev community stuff. But it's basically it's sort of similar to what I was working on at AWS, and I'm such a Linux dork that I just miss working on Linuxy things. So I've considered approaching Bluefin as like a fun side project thing, but it's basically like a Fedora distribution that you can run on a Steam Deck, which I think is very cool. Or you could run it on a Chromebook. It's Linux. You can run it anywhere. It's great. But for that, I ran into George at KubeCon North America in Chicago, and I was just like, George, what would you recommend as like a cool first thing for me to get into? Like, granted, I have a little bit of Linux dev under my belt, but even still, like all these things are built so differently. Like, it can kind of be wild to approach these things in a first time basis. So just that human aspect of just like being like, hey, what what would you recommend? And I got some great recommendations and some good things to just like look at. And yeah, that human aspect of things can be so big. Again, it can be hard when you don't have those spaces always in communities, but if there's like a GitHub discussion thing, that can be a good place to start a discussion on like what would you recommend to like, hack on or get started on or try something. I'd love to like give back to this community in some way. Yeah, it can be hard. I don't know. I don't know if this is like a very well solved problem, honestly, in open source. I think big communities and small communities all suffer like have a hard time with this. You even get this in corporations where it's like, oh, we are a software team, we have this thing, maybe we have an intern, maybe we have a new software engineer, or just somebody coming onto the team who doesn't know this software yet or doesn't know the programming language. Like that's something that always seems to be a struggle. It's like, what do we give them to help them start and get familiar with the project? I've seen it done well, I've seen it done very poorly. Pair programming can always be a good way to get started. So if you can find some excuse me, if you can find somebody in those communities who is maybe willing to pair program with you for a little bit, that could be huge. Last thing I'll say on that though is that be mindful of these maintainers and collaborators' time, because they want to find these people that they can like mentor and lead into leadership positions. I think that's every maintainer's like dream, is to like find that person who's gonna like go from absolute noob to maintainer to collaborator to leader or whatever, because that just kind of lifts the tide of everybody. If I found like 5 people in Cobra who I could start basically mentoring and be like, okay, you now help me with Cobra stuff, it's not just me or me and Mark or two other people or something, that helps everybody, because then things are getting addressed faster, or things are getting reviewed faster. It's not just on me to like cut releases and stuff. And yet I don't always want to give a ton of time to people who are like, oh, like mentor me, and then they don't show up or something, or they don't show up to pair programming sessions or something. Like I generally have kind of, and maybe this is on me, but I sort of have like a little cold heart sometimes to some of these people coming up to projects, because I don't quite trust them yet. Although there are a few people who, if they ask me for some time, I would give it to them, because I do trust them in the community and they've given some great work already. Building that trust can be kind of hard, and maybe a first step to like finding some really good stuff to work on.
Well, I think we dove enough to find the human soft side of it, right? Where you kind of have to build those relationships. And there's a really great book that I read years and years ago by Adam Grant called Give and Take. And it's about the reciprocity styles. And so I think the best way, it feels like it's a foundational pillar of open source, but it's the giver. Like you've got to give stuff to build trust and get in return.
Right.
That sounds like
the human side is big. It's, you kind of forget it sometimes, especially in these like chronically online communities and stuff. Like we've circled each other a bit on X a little bit, and this is really the first time we're chatting and stuff. But even this 1 hour we've spent together, I'd be more than happy to like say you had a Go thing or a Cobra thing you needed help with. Even just having a bit of that FaceTime is huge, right? And helps to build a lot of trust. Don't forget the human aspect, I guess, is to wrap all that up.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. I think we got all through all the questions, and that feels like the perfect spot to kind of end the stream on the human element and the human side of open source. I'd love to have you back on, and we can dive more into this. The pair program that you mentioned is kind of my goal with this next series of streams that I'm going to be doing, is just walking through what I've learned and what I've been doing with the Ratify project. Hopefully that'll be maybe used as onboarding material later, but it also helps me to learn, because one thing that I learned early on in my career is the best way to learn is to teach. And so trying to get that as close to the grindstone as I can. But with that, I just want to thank you, John. It's been great to chat with you, get to know you a little bit better, to hear your wisdom on this. And just messaged you like a couple days ago, and you're like, yeah, sure, let's do this. So I'm super grateful for that. So
no problem.
Just thank you for your time, and we'll catch everybody else that joined the live stream on the next one. Most likely will be Thursday at the normal 2:30 time Central. But thank you all for joining, and Happy New Year, since it's the second. But take care, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Josh.